Hello and welcome to Living a Culture of Life podcast by Human Life International. I'm your host, Colleen, and I'm joined today by Dr. Brian Clowes, our Director of Research, and Father Boquet, our President. So welcome to the podcast.
Well, thank you, Colleen. Great to be with you.
It's great to have you here, Father. It's great to have you here, Brian. And today we're going to be doing a follow-up episode to last week's episode where we talked about the Kissinger report with Brian. Brian's done a lot of research on the global depopulation agenda. And today I thought it would be cool to do an episode to give all of you listeners a look at what this is like on the ground. So Father and Brian, you two have done a lot of traveling around the globe on missions. So I thought you two would probably be the best ones to be able to give our listeners a look at this. So Brian, I think I'll toss the ball in your court first. How have you seen the depopulationist, IPPF, Marie Stopes International, all these different groups? What are some of the things that you've seen on the ground in the countries that you've traveled on mission to?
There's so many things, so many thoughts crowding my head right now. What they all have in common is a complete lack of respect for human dignity. They treat people, especially women of childbearing ages, more like cattle than human beings. Mm-hmm. And so there are many instances I've seen, most of them almost entirely in Africa and Asia.
Okay.
One time in Sri Lanka, we traveled up way up into the hills, the mountains there, to about 1 mile in elevation to this very small tea processing town that we've been invited up there for. And we talked to about 60 women there, and all of them had been visited by Planned Parenthood and told that these pills that they're getting and the injections they're getting were vitamins instead of birth control. And we saw this in also one of the trips to the central part of Uganda, a little town called Tororo, where the Marie Stopes clinic there had a person who had a crisis of conscience and came to see us, Father Jonathan Opio and myself, and they talked about how they were advertising malaria shots, anti-malaria shots, but instead they were injecting with Depo-Provera, which provides them 3 to 6 months of sterility. Elsewhere in the world, one of the worst things I've ever seen was my first trip to the Philippines in 1994. Staying with some Dominican sisters who were also qualified as medical doctors. Mm-hmm. And every Tuesday and Thursday, I believe, they had a little clinic where they pulled IUDs out of women for free or up to $1 if they could afford it. None of them knew they had IUDs put into them because the sisters had noticed a few months before that that entire area of the country women just stopped having children at all. Mm-hmm. And so they wanted to investigate the problem, and they found that these women told them that beforehand a U.S.-funded safe motherhood program had said, we're going to give safe motherhood exams to all women 15 to 44. Mm-hmm. And that's when you know something evil is coming up, those numbers, the childbearing years. And so they did. They gave them safe childbearing pelvic exams. But while they're doing it, without telling, they put IUDs into all of them.
Wow.
So this is the kind of thing we've run into many times, many different permutations, but the whole thing is always directed towards one goal, and that's to stop childbearing as much as they possibly can. If not voluntarily, then involuntarily.
Yeah, because those sound like they're more the forced abortion. Have you also seen just the propaganda of these groups coming in and like trying to sell contraception and abortion to women?
They start very early. In the Philippines and several African countries, we've seen schoolyards where the stone walls are painted with family planning posters. So typically you'll have two similar portraits next to each other, one house just exploding with children and the environment is destroyed, the air is all brown and the fish are all dying in the water. And in the other one, you have 2 or 3 children in each family and everybody's smiling and the air is completely clean and blue and the fish are even smiling. And oddly enough, on the side where they have family planning, you'll always see a Catholic church and a priest.
Wow.
Which implies that the Catholic Church approves of this.
Is that important for people in these countries?
Oh, yes, especially in places where there's a lot of faith like Uganda and the Philippines. Mm-hmm. So they start propagandizing the kids very young.
Yeah. And how long have you been doing mission trips with HLI?
I started before even going to work for HLI, so about 33 years.
Okay. Yeah, so you've seen this. Have you seen a progression over time of the propaganda changing or are they still doing forced sterilizations today? Or was that something that was happening more back in the 90s? Has there been any
I'm
progression?
sure they still do it. It's
Okay.
just better covered up. And the
Okay.
propaganda is not quite as blatant as it used to be.
Hmm.
You won't see the schoolyard stone walls all covered with things like that because people discovered it and the parents objected to it.
Okay.
So now it's just transmitted through the teacher.
Okay. Father, did you know that any of this was going on before you came to HLI? What was your background in like knowing about how the population control groups have been like impacting third world countries or developing countries before you came here?
Well, before coming to HLI, I mean, I was quite familiar, Colleen, with what was happening on a global scene, not as detailed as I would come to learn. Obviously reading articles, being familiar, with, the way our government approaches its own policies. But until coming to HLI, when you really have a deeper dive, Father Marks, our founder, and all those that have worked with HLI over the years, and especially out in the mission field, I mean, see firsthand, the consequences. And as Brian was just pointing out, I mean, the shift in how of approach, because now by using the teachers and using textbooks and using other mediums, obviously this conversation gets a deeper dive, even within those communities that are not seen visibly anymore. Maybe see the billboards. One time, Brian and I were in Uganda giving a presentation to the House of the Congress, to members of the House. And they tried to tell us that these things were not really running rampant in their country. And I just pointed out the window and look at all the billboards around the house that are promoting contraception. So how can you say it's not prolific? And so coming to HLI has helped me to see, because of the intricacies of our work with people on the ground who are the first ones experiencing the result of U.S. policy, not just the United States, as Brian has done many times in exposing the culprits, has done much research and showing like UK aid. I mean, all the Western countries are engaged in this work of depopulation and promoting, contraception, abortion, sterilization, and now gender ideology, homosexuality, all which, in a sense, are promoting sterility. And so it really has been now 14 years that I've been here, in my 14th year, and every time I go out into the field, I'm amazed, at what I see. So it has been a learning experience for me as well, and still a learning experience.
What's the most shocking thing that you've seen in the mission field? Like something that just made you a little bit, so like what Brian was saying with the woman who had like forced IUDs. Is there any stories like that that you've seen that just really took you aback and went like, wow, there's so much evil here?
On all these many years, I mean, I've been in 92 countries, and not all for HLI, the majority of them for HLI, but I hear stories and hear people's difficulty, and I think the ones that stand out the most to me is the propaganda that has come to so many people thinking they were embracing some great good, and in reality, we're actually participating in a great harm, a harm to themselves, a harm to the community. And and just the realization by coming through our training programs and going through our materials, the realization comes to them, and there's a great sadness. And I think that has been the eye opener in many ways. People really are heartbroken, saddened, especially those that are wanting to live their Christian faith when they find out that they're doing something that they never heard was wrong, or maybe that even sadly a minister, a clergyman, a religious, a catechist didn't tell them there was anything wrong with. And so I think of one story out of New Zealand, a young couple that was struggling with infertility, and how they were advised to take the path, Colleen, of in vitro fertilization, and really approach the church through its minister to ask, is this licit? And to be told by that particular priest that we are for children, and this method helps you to achieve that end, only to realize that there's something within them still didn't feel comfortable with it. And so by pursuing a little more research on their own, they read what the church officially teaches. And they were saddened because one was the disappointment of guidance or misguidance, but also I think they were sad as time went forward that they never thought that there was an option. What could be licit? And because Father was not familiar himself, or chose not to be familiar, I can't read his intent, of course, but they were never given an opportunity to hear the full spectrum of what our church does teach. and those wonderful technologies and interventions that are illicit that might have resulted in the conception of a child. And for me, that was heartbreaking. I felt their pain and in the sadness of their own plight and the realization that we will never know. Now they're beyond childbearing years, and sadly, adoption is not something very common in their culture. So it makes it very difficult. That's an example. Or meeting, women who very tragically over the years embraced the contraceptive mentality, embracing hormonal contraception, only to realize when they came to a point in life when they wanted to welcome children, they were married and they wanted to welcome children, and not being able to conceive, then to learn that the many years, decades of use of contraception has now left them in many ways incapable of having children. And it's heartbreaking because our churches, the good that she promotes, is not being, it's not forthcoming in many of these places because, again, a lack of formation, lack of catechesis. So back to your original question, then I'll toss it back to you in Brian, is that I think that's been the greatest thing for me with HLI is Father Mark's, really his vision for HLI, it was really on point. And that is, especially in those beginning when he was dealing with the acceptance of contraception in the culture and how many were rejecting the church's teaching and rejecting Humanae Vitae and the beauty of that perennial teaching, said if this is not challenged and we don't introduce the good, then these falsifications are just going to continue to escalate into other falsifications, abortion, euthanasia and so forth. And I see that with my own eyes. And so it really has been a very good learning experience and to see how this apostolate is attempting to turn that tide.
Yeah, for sure. A question that came up to me while you were talking about that was wondering why there's a lack of catechesis. Could you, either of you, if either of you have thoughts on this, give some insight into why people, priests, parishioners, why people don't understand what the church teaches about IVF or contraception in these countries?
I think one of the reasons people don't talk about it is they don't like to talk about it. These are very personal things. The most personal things you can talk to revolve around the marital act, like contraception, the possibility of early abortion, various artificial reproductive technologies, very uncomfortable things to talk about. And I think that's what keeps a lot of people from talking about them. Although they are critical, they are central to the practice of the Catholic faith. People tend to shy away from them because they think they might offend, they think they might be very uncomfortable themselves, and I think that has a lot to do with it.
I would agree. I think that, in many ways, they're taboo in some cultures to talk about in the public forum. And what we have found, even in the mission field, in our training programs, in our times of catechesis, even among pro-life leaders, our healthcare workers, our priests, our religious, it still is an uncomfortable place for some of them because it's just not something you talk about in that forum. But this is the challenge today because it has been brought into the public forum with such a force by the anti-life agenda that we cannot leave it, in a sense, on the sidelines. We can't leave it just for these little intimate moments. It has to be brought up into the public forum so that from the public forum it can be addressed. And so it has been a challenge. We've been told, especially by priests, who say the reason why it's not because they're opposed to preaching or teaching, it's just not something you would speak of from the pulpit. And so where's the kind of the largest opportunity that most priests have really is at the moment that they're preaching. And so here is as Brian just said, here is a very important topic that touches the most intimate parts of human existence, marriage itself, the marital act. And yet that which is threatening that good or those goods are not being discussed, not being approached. So, which really makes our work, depends on the country, depends on the region, a little more challenging. But we have also not been deterred by that, and we explain ourselves very clearly, Colleen, to our audience. The reason why we're going to bring up certain subjects today is because of the great threat. And if we don't approach this, then where will people hear? How will they understand? And this is where some of the examples that Brian has already given, and that we have talked about in many ways here in this podcast and in Spirit and Life and so forth in our writings and our resources, is then people will turn where? To the secular media. They'll turn to the secular resources to find answers, and the answers they're going to get there won't have anything to do with human dignity or the integrity or good that we're trying to advance. So it really is a challenge.
Yeah, that definitely makes sense. There was actually a woman who commented on our podcast video on chastity recently, saying that when she was a girl, there was no good Catholic resources on that. So, like, where did you turn? Cosmopolitan. So, if the people that are putting out the, like, quote unquote expertise on these topics are people that have an anti child, anti family agenda, or just not even a religious agenda and don't understand the great spiritual depth there, what you're getting isn't going to be the fullness of truth. So, that makes sense. I know that one of the things that the population groups will do, I know they do this in Malawi, I'm not sure if they do it anywhere else, which is why I'm bringing this question up, is the free contraception program, where they drive around and they hand out free contraception to people in villages. I know that in Malawi, they'll go to villages that you can only get to on a bike. You can't even get to by car, and just hand out free contraception in these villages. Have you seen this happen on the ground?
Oh, yes. In several places they're usually called RHUs, reproductive health units. And these young people, maybe in their early 20s, get a very small salary or a bounty to go around after receiving a couple of days of training to pass out these pills and various other birth control devices. And they have no idea what they're doing, really. There's no examination of the woman's health. Oftentimes, they'll be using several different kinds of birth control at once. And Kathy and I went to Uganda, Tororo again. I think it was in 2011, we visited a small hospital there, which was trying to care for these women who had been poisoned by all of these birth control drugs. And we had to carry them out of the hospital and put them under a tree in the shade and then talk to them. And they suffer all kinds of terrible side effects from using 3 or 4 kinds of birth control simultaneously, from paralysis to stroke to all kinds of skin problems, hair falling out. It was pretty bad to see. And it's another example of goal-oriented objective here, just to get as much sterility as you possibly can, not caring about the health of the person.
Yeah, I think that Brian just we you're in these moments and you see it with your own eyes, but you also look at the young people. And Colleen, you mentioned chastity just a little while ago, and when you look at some of the schools that we visited just recently, when we went to our 30th anniversary in Tanzania to celebrate our 30th anniversary in Tanzania, and being brought to some of the schools in the rural villages, and you see the flip side where virtue and the beauty of human dignity and the beauty of the human person are being taught and advanced. And you see this joy in young people. And we all know what it is to be tempted. We know that temptation just doesn't go away. And so that there will always be those allurements out there trying to drag us into their ideologies or into their practices. But when you give a good foundation and a root that upon which people can build, they know the good and they want the good and they seek the good. And once they know the good, you can see the joy and the innocence in that. And I think what always angers me, in our mission work, is seeing the exploitation of people and the usury of people, as Brian mentioned, treating people as things, as commodities, or as cattle, as he said earlier, and just approaching not a human person, but a thing to be used and a thing to be violated, but that's not the human person, and so the challenge today is trying to unpack the damage, because what happens, as we've said many times in our podcast and talking, those that are advocating for these falsifications, these i.e. in vitro fertilization, abortion, sterilization, and contraception, and so forth, have a tremendous amount of money. And they're being backed by, sadly, our own government here in the United States and by many other governments and entities and non-government organizations, and in the millions. And Brian, that could be a podcast by itself, so that I think would be great for our audience to really hear. Maybe that's something Colleen, y'all can do later, is just to talk about those groups. Who are those groups? And, and how much money has actually been spent since, Brian's last calculation was 1996, if I remember, till
It says since 1990, a total of 210 billion on population control.
Right. So you think about that and how the damage that's been done with that, and the falsification really is saying that trying to convince people that children make you poor, and not really looking, as Emil Hagamu has said, our director for all of English-speaking Africa, who sees firsthand on a weekly basis the consequences, is that they never change the systemic reasons for the poverty or why there are issues in the government in living. So no clean water, no electrification, no farming equipment, no access to good health care, and a litany, contraception, and all those other issues don't address those systemic issues. And so that is the challenge that we face, is not only exposing the anti-life ideology, but why is their agenda there? And that would be a great thing. I know today we can't get in that in great detail, but that would be something worth really talking about and really advancing, so people can see that it's not a conspiracy. What it is. John Paul called it a conspiracy against life. So I guess we can say there is a conspiracy. There really is a conspiracy against the dignity of life.
Yeah, it also seems like you're facing an uphill battle if you're trying to convince people who are living in poverty, who have been told their whole lives that not having children is the solution to poverty. Like, it's almost, if you're not able to like take them out of the poverty, it's really hard to then convince them that what they believe is the solution isn't actually the solution, and that that's actually like what they really need is better drinking water or solving those systemic issues. So you're kind of not just working against propaganda that's saying don't have children, but then you're also dealing with the fact that these people are living in very hard situations, and that they have been told for 50 years that the solution to those hard situations is not having children.
John Paul, and as has Pope Francis, Pope Benedict, spoke of how should we respond to these issues. One thing that makes our mission difficult is we don't have the financial means to be able to provide always a path forward, to address some of those systemic issues. So in other words, our mission is not about farming or about clean water or about some of those other systemic issues that are needed: healthcare, education, facilities, schools, good roads. So it really is a challenge. And it's where John Paul, I'm thinking more in my mind, a recent reading some things he wrote on this subject was, how do we provide the means, though? What's the role of the United States? What's the role of other governments and other entities? How do we respond to the need of our brothers and sisters in the developing world? And where it's not an ideology, or what Pope Francis calls a throwaway culture that is being pushed upon a people, or what Pope Benedict would say that, these are not acts of charity that we're talking about. These are violating the good and the beauty of life and marriage in these countries. So how could we, turn it around and use those resources? Imagine if we could take $200+ billion and not only address the systemic issues, which we could, but imagine we could also do within those communities in promoting opportunity for families to have resources they need to raise their families. This is what John Paul was talking about. So not only technology and on issues of agriculture and education and electrification and so forth, yes, but also the other practical things. How are we helping couples? How are we helping parents with their children? How are we helping them in the formation of their children? How are we giving them the means to be open to life? How are we subsidizing, if you will, their other needs? So this is a larger question that makes it hard on us too in the mission field, because that's what people will often say too, which really does make the heart sad, because oftentimes, as we've talked about in this podcast, when a person who might be abortion minded comes and the person ministering to them says, well, what do you need? And they'll say, well, I need, and they start naming it. And the person that's caring for them says, I can take care of that. All of a sudden, well, then I choose life, because they're worried about caring for their child and whatever that reason is. But once you resolve that real issue to them, and to us, it might seem minute, but to them, it's very real. And so once you resolve it, so here's another example in the sense, how can we practically resolve some of those fundamental issues that our families and people need? And as Pope Francis has said so vividly in my mind, and just read something just the other day of him again, is solidarity, to walk in solidarity. When he says walk in their shoes. And it's true. I mean, I think that's what, I will tell you this, and I'll toss it back to you and Brian, is I feel like they're family. I think that to me is the thing that's become more painful, in leaving them, because you're there with them, you walk with them, you hear their difficulties, you hear their joys, you celebrate with them, their wonder and their awe, and then you see what needs to be done, but you don't have the means. But if you could stay, and it makes it difficult because now you feel part of their family, but that's what the church wants us to feel. And I believe that's why I would love to take everyone with me into that mission field, because once you feel that and you see that, you no longer think of a them. It's really an us, and it's a we. And that's the sadness with the depopulation mentality. It looks at a them, a they, and not an us, a we, my brother, my sister, someone that really I should be in solidarity with. And to that, Pope Francis has been ringing that bell, which the church rings and has rung for millennia, but he has been very, very strong in ringing that bell and loudly, trying to awaken in the world a sensitivity to others that has been lost.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's definitely true. One of the things I want to go back to earlier in the conversation is that, Brian, you were saying that they used to have the billboards outside of schools promoting only having 2 children or 1 child instead of having a large family, and that now you don't see the billboards as much because that's all moved into the schools and the teachers are the one talking about it. Why did that change? How did the teachers end up on the side of the depopulationists?
Well, in the Philippines, for an example, we have some great people there. Pro-life Philippines, Dr. Rene Joseph Bulacer down in Cebu, in the central part of the country. And at the time, we had Orestes Monzon and his wife Edna, who were doctors, who were working with many of the elite, the congressmen, the senators, some of the big city mayors like Mayor Lito Atienza of Manila. And these politicians really picked up the message and ran with it, like a no contraception day or year, perhaps in Manila, by Lito Atienza and his wife Beng. But the politicians picked it up, and when the politicians start paying attention, then the United States and the other people who are funding these programs start to figure maybe we better be a little less blatant about what we're doing here. And they're very, very sneaky. They can get the message of anti-life to you in 1,000 different ways. And so all they've done is go underground. And we have to be very aware of what's going on. We have to be talking to these teachers, these doctors and nurses, the principals and so on, to find out what's going on in the country. And that's the role of our regional coordinators and our country leaders.
That makes sense. So I'm guessing a big way that they do this is through sex education.
Oh, absolutely. If you lose the battle for sex education, you've lost the war for abortion.
What have you seen with sex education programs that are anti-child, anti-family around the world? Is there anything that stands out to you that they're talking about or how they're getting children on their side?
It's mainly this message of freedom, but an unalloyed freedom, one that is not guided by a properly formed conscience. You have the right to not listen to the priests and your parents. You have the right to be transgender if you want. Anything that they push is always oriented towards sterility or less children. Delay marriage, have as much fun as you want, just use contraception, be responsible. So the entire message is oriented towards a false type of freedom that Pope John Paul II talked about a lot.
That makes sense. Father, what have you seen with the sex education in these countries?
In Latin America, I have seen not only textbooks, which we've seen in Africa, we've seen in many other parts of Asia, where are introducing kids as young as kindergarten age, even sometimes preschool age, 3-year-olds, 4-year-olds, just in cartoon form, to these various agendas. Free to touch, touch is good and experience is good. Or I've seen where 5-year-olds are being taught. We showed a video of this happening to priests and bishops so that they can be aware of it. This was in Latin America, and where 5-year-olds are being taught how to take a prophylactic and place it onto a phallic. And so it happens. These are 5-year-olds, and so there is a hidden, way in the sense of kind of working underground that Brian just mentioned, working through, textbooks alone, working through other mediums. But then you have those that are just more aggressive, like we see in our own country with these library hours and so forth. So there's so many ways in which it is being done. And as we have become desensitized, especially in Western countries, but you see it also going on in the developing world. We become so desensitized to these assaults that they're becoming normalized. So we're not fighting against them. We're not rejecting them. We're kind of rolling over, and so and that's a real challenge today that has to really be. That's why, as Brian mentioned, is why we get to the doctors, why we get to the teachers, why we want to get to the parents. And so all the ones who are influencing or have an influence upon our young, because our young are the victims here. They're the ones being exploited globally. They are the victims of this anti-life culture and the spirit of death, as John Paul would call it, that is really robbing them of their innocence, trying to unmoor them from those that are trying, like their parents, who are setting a moral compass for them in life. So by debunking their parents or lying to their parents, or the schools tell them, don't tell your parents this, keep your textbooks here. I mean, I've seen many, many instances in many parts of the world. And most of the time, parents are oblivious. They have no idea what's being taught to their kids until something unfolds in front of them. And then they go, well, how did we get here? So part of the education is to bring all the people into this conversation. So I'm thinking right now, and I wish I remember the Latin American country with Mario Rojas, our director for Latin America. We were there together, and we brought Congress people together. We brought teachers together. We brought experts in the fields of child development. And what we did is we just set them loose, into this arena of priests, of bishops, of religious, of lay leaders, catechists, to expose what was happening in their own country. And they were shocked because they don't hear it. And so, because one, the Catholic Church is not advancing those things, but what they don't realize in many cases, the same textbooks, the same materials are present. And so it was to help them to see what's going on in their government. What's their government advocating for? Why are these people in their communities? As Brian would do, is who are those groups, right? Who are the main players? You named them in Africa, obviously, International Planned Parenthood Federation, or we're looking for Marie Stopes, but there are many other names that mask themselves out there and infiltrate underground into these communities and start doing these various agendas and ideologies that most people miss. They don't see. We're good hounds. We go smelling around because we know they're there. We know they're there. So our task is to work with the local leaders to find out who these groups are and bring them to the light. If I may, one more story. We were in it wasn't Namibia. And Brian, we usually tag off each other a lot of times when we do these interviews and podcasts. And so, is that the country was with the bishop, and where we were exposing to him local groups, and he all of a sudden you watched him, his eyes kind of widened because he said, "Wait a minute, I've been working with that group, and not for their agenda." But because they come in and they don't start with the negative, they're not going to expose themselves. What they're going to do is say, I can help you with, let's say, clean water. I can give you a resource for this. But once you invite them into the community, as Brian mentioned, you almost kind of have that. And what you'll see is maybe a T-shirt, or you'll see some type of propaganda where you'll see the church's logo, or you see the diocesan logo. And it gives the impression to the local people that the church is for this. And so when you expose it, and that's what happened there, was the bishop just kind of said, wait a minute, pause, time out. Tell me more about this. Or when we met in Lesotho with the king, and Brian did a very, very good job in how to approach His Excellency. And we gave him material to know about some of the groups working in his country that he himself knows they're there, but didn't know what they were doing as we would know what they're doing. And he says, what's your proof? Which I think is a very valid question. And that's what Brian gave him. Here's your proof. And so part of this is really, our work is not just in the catechesis, in the formation, but also exposing the ideologies and those who are promoting those ideologies.
Brian, what was that proof?
The proof is it's just a little bit of paper with a thumb drive. And the paper describes how to use a thumb drive. The thumb drive has dossiers on 4,000 of these groups. Not only the 60 or so that are single-purpose, large population control groups like Population Services International, Population Communications, and Allen Guttmacher Institute, outfits like that, but the thousands of others that do it as a part-time kind of thing, because all of these groups, from Heifer International to Doctors Without Borders, they're all involved in it somehow. Not as a primary objective, but they've been conned. They've been swindled into thinking that you can't possibly really help unless you promote family planning. All of your efforts will be in vain if you have too many people. So perhaps we should spend some time reaching some of these groups.
If I may just add to that, how valuable that tool is. Because one thing we do with local pro-life leaders, because and this again goes back to Father Marx's vision, HLI doesn't go in and just take over a work, a ministry, an apostolic work. It supports the local work. Why? Because the local people know what's happening locally. And we are there to support them, to help them in any way that we can, or in the ways that we can. And one of those ways is to help them identify. Because most people don't pay attention until something hits them in the face. That's just the way it is for most of us. Until something shakes our can, we're not usually aware of it until it affects us personally. Well, for pro-lifers, this kind of things affect us personally. We take it personally because we see the beauty of human life, and we see the beauty of marriage and the good that marriage is, and for the common good. And so these are threats to this. And so by going in with those dossiers, and Brian's very honest. You can only put so much on a thumb drive, and there's so many other groups. But if you know the key players, then you have to just kind of dig into them, because they change their names. They create new little subsets. They change their approach, because it's like anything else. If I'm trying to, you just find another way to sell your goods. And so I think the real challenge now for us here in the United States that we are up against is what Brian shared in the previous podcast, and that was, what is the state policy of the United States? What was this document? How did this document affect and has affected and still affecting our approach toward the developing world? And so that's what I'm hopeful that as these subjects keep being talked about, and good people like ourselves keep bringing it to the surface, and people in key positions, we can maybe begin to untether, these things and promote a great good. I mean, if I had my little magic wand, if I could take since 1990 until the current moment, whatever that number would be, in that 200 plus billion, imagine if I had that much money, in my possession to be able to, what would I do with that? And obviously I would pull a big team of experts together and say, what can we do? How can we be of benefit? So imagine the United States, would turn its approach and really look at how can we use our blessings, the goods that we have, for the common good of our brothers and sisters around the world, which we have an obligation to, and so how do we do that? And that is I wish I could sit at a table with those people making those decisions. And I'm very hopeful from what I'm hearing, with the new administration coming in, that there is going to be a conversation about some of this. Not enough, it's my opinion, of course, but it's a start. And in turning that good, and I'll just give you one more story, and I know I have used it before, but it's about in Puerto Rico. Under the first Trump administration, when they began to defund this anti-life agenda, and many of the NGOs that were receiving, the United Nations and others, there were two abortion facilities on the same main road. One was privately funded. The other was being supported or subsidized by money from the United States. The day that those funds were cut and there was no opportunity for those funds to continue, one of them shut down, the one that was being publicly funded. The private one was still open, And pro-lifers there, we're dealing with that. But it does show you that our policies, our approach does save lives. It makes a difference. And I would say that, reiterating what Emil Hagamu said, imagine what we could do with 200 plus billion, just say in Africa alone, where such a large percentage have no access to clean drinking water or access to good farming equipment or electrification, sanitation. Life would change radically in these places. And then be able to share these goods. And imagine if UK did that, if many others in Europe did that with their charitable, so-called charitable programs, or Japan, or New Zealand, or Australia. It'd be life-changing. But right now we have a mindset that is really what John Paul called that spirit of death. It really has so infiltrated how we approach human life that I don't think we don't see it. Many people don't see the harm. So that's why I like to drag them with me into the field. I'll show you the harm. We'll show you what it does.
Yeah, for sure. And also just going back to the 2 abortion clinics and how one shut down and one didn't. It's like, even if by stopping the funding, we only shut down 50% of the abortion clinics around the world, that's still going to make a drastic difference. And then it's like, if you're trying to fight a giant, like, evil thing and you're able to cut it in half and it's like half as powerful, then like you're more likely to be able to overcome and defeat the other half if you can stop it from having double the force. So I think that's important to keep in mind. It's like cutting off the funding won't fix everything, but it'll at least make the problem more manageable for the underfunded pro-lifers on the ground. As like we've seen here in the States, it's you have all these, somehow pro-lifers still are able to win on like ballot initiatives, even though groups like Planned Parenthood are dumping billions of dollars or millions of dollars into places like Florida to try to, like with the recent Amendment 4, they were spending so much money there trying to get it to pass and it still didn't. And that was a great victory. So imagine if you didn't have those millions coming in, you'd start having more and more victories by greater and greater margins because you wouldn't be up against such like a monolithic force.
And if I may, we've talked about this, and maybe there's something you can put in the notes. The Malawi story is a good example. You're up against Goliath with $3 million in International Planned Parenthood, and yet through the grant that HLI gives to the local pro-life leaders there, that team was able to, through the chastity programs or education programs in the schools, to help show young people the beauty of human sexuality, the beauty of what God has in store for those through marriage and conjugal love and the welcoming of children. And then when the other side comes in and tries to propagandize them, that they realize this great harm and say, be gone with you. And they chase them out the school. So you're absolutely correct. Every little inroad you make, every little success you make changes the momentum. And we see it here in the United States, right? People with the overturning of Roe, though we still have a great fight in front of us, and it's still a very big battle, but that one victory, a massive victory, took the conversation and moved it on another level. And so it now has given a momentum. And in the mission world, I will tell you, and that is, Colleen, that people saw this and said, wow, that means we can change bad laws. We can undo an injustice. And so, yes, it does. It does make a difference. And that's why we get up, the 3 of us, every day, and we come into this office, or we go out into that mission field and we sit hours on planes and, and the challenges in the mission field. And, why? Because we believe in this cause. We believe in this mission, and we believe in the good, and we believe in people, God's people. And so it's a real blessing.
It really is. I love that Malawi story. I think I mentioned it in the episode I did with Brian that came out last week. And we did a podcast with Michelle on it too. It's one of my favorite ones to bring up. And another thing that was cool about that is that I think Planned Parenthood Malawi called out Father Z for being one of the reasons that they couldn't give away their free contraception, because they do the free contraception program there as well. And they kept trying to give it away and nobody would take it. And they're just like, oh, it's because of HLI Malawi. Brian, I want to go back to talking about the charities that mask themselves as clean water charities or as all these other types of charities, but then do population control on the side. What advice do you have for listeners here in America who want to be able to give money to charities that provide like actual real aid to people in Africa and don't know how to navigate that because they sneak these things, like these charities that seem like they're doing something good or doing something on the side? Because I've done that. There was a concert I wanted to go to a couple of years ago, and it was going to be benefiting some aid program over in Africa. And I was like, I don't know anything about this. Like, I can look on their website. It seems fine, but I don't know what they're doing on the side. And obviously, I don't want my money going towards handing out free contraception to kids in Africa. But at the same time, if you're trying to be a good charitable Catholic and you want to give money to provide clean drinking water for families in Africa, you can kind of feel like your hands are tied. So what advice would you have for listeners in that position?
Well, what I do is go to the website and go to the search routine and just type in reproductive, because that's their cover word for everything, sexual and reproductive, or just reproductive.
Mm-hmm.
And 90% of the time, you will find what they're doing in that area. And if you don't find it, then you have to do a little more digging, usually looking all over the website. But that 90% of the time will tell you whether or not you're dealing with a good group or not. Type in reproductive in quotes and then see what it comes up with. And usually, yeah.
Oh, do you have to worry about groups that also fund them? Because I know sometimes they'll have like charities that work in conjunction with the UN, with like the UN. I don't know if they have a clean drinking water group, but the UN has all these different programs that do things. So if these smaller charities are working in conjunction with something like the United Nations, which has so much bad stuff they do you have to be worried about that?
Usually not, because they usually will cooperate with the UN in their main areas of expertise.
Okay.
Okay, so, but if you have somebody, say, who's in conjunction with UNFPA, that's the only one of the major UN agencies which has as its purpose reproductive health.
Mm-hmm.
So avoid anything that has any connection to UNFPA. But let's say you have somebody who's dealing with World Health Organization or the World Transportation Organization, something like that, World Communications Organization, one of these outfits, you're probably going to be all right, because they will not be working with them on reproductive health, because that's the UNFPA's bailiwick.
Okay.
Although you have to be aware that all of the UN agencies are very pro-abortion.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and that's why we're hoping to start our mission to the United Nations next year.
Yeah.
So hopefully that'll accomplish some good things, stop them from at least slipping reproductive rights into all their their policies. Did you want to say something, Father?
What I would suggest also, and Brian does a very good job of this in investigating, and that is, from the U.S. point, is because of taxation and because of being a nonprofit in various ways which our country structures, how an organization can work abroad, that using people's, tax, the 990s is a way to kind of dig a little deeper. Who are they supporting, or maybe where their money's coming from, is a way to find due diligence. And so I think what your point is that, we have to do our very best, to see how our monies would be used by this organization before we just go out and give. One thing about the Catholic Church, which is the largest charitable institution working around the world outside of the major governments, but is the idea that the church does her diligence, and sometimes even she, can sometimes step into a pool and because after even doing the diligence, you go forward in time and then you find out, wait a minute, this group is a little different than what they said they were going to be. So you got to back out of it. So it's a challenge to all of us, but the church herself gives us an example of how we can approach working with groups, never advocating, for anything that's going to be contradictory to our principles. And if we do so, we don't work with them. We go somewhere else. We do another thing, or we do it ourselves, period. But we have seen in the mission field, groups that are working with malaria nets, a great good in itself, digging fresh water wells, a good in itself. But sometimes they becoming tainted because the only way that you can get into these communities is by working with the big groups. And, we've seen that. Even Brian had mentioned a few other groups, in the mission field recently, and people were kind of surprised to hear them because they know the big names. And you go, well, what are they doing? And then he shows them, that they're and he has colors, and I'll say that for his podcast, he can talk about all of them. But the idea that he'll show you through just the colorations. Obviously red, fully involved, kind of thing. But then you might get down to something in a lighter color, which means they're dabbling, they're a little bit involved, and of course even there we want to make sure that we're not, even a little, but we have to really do our work. And that's what I would say to our Catholic families here. The work abroad is important, and the charitable works that we support through our church or many other ways that are groups that are working is just do your diligence. Read about them. Just don't go just to the website alone, in a sense, and okay, I'm done. I don't see anything. As Brian said, dig a little deeper, take a little more time. be patient, because which you want to make sure that you're doing a great good. And oftentimes what I've recommended from being in parish ministry before coming to HLI is find a group that you believe in, you've done your work on, you've made your, and support it directly. If you don't want to go through some other charitable organization that might be funding that particular group. And that's how, I recommend. So I think what's important really is, as we're talking about, is there is a great need. There's a great good to be done. Our brothers and sisters in the developing world and many other parts of the world, even in the first world, need help. And so by talking about this and exposing those entities and institutions that are working against these principles is also promoting a great good, because you want to help people to see there are people among you that are not well intended. Their agenda is evil. I mean, they are assaulting great goods, and we should know who they are, and especially our leaders within the church. And that's why we're patient with them, because many times they have great need, and they need schools, they need infrastructure, and these groups come in and dangle carrots, of great wealth, and but you want to believe them, because you want to believe that people are good, but then you find out later on that they maybe are doing other things. And as one bishop in Kenya told me a few years gone by, we know how bad they are. We were talking about this particular. I'm not going to mention the bishop, not mention the place, but just the idea that the bishop acknowledged, no, we know they're bad, but there is an aspect of what they bring to us. We don't, and we watch them closely. And I think that's what, so he himself admitted, but he also said, we're doing our part to make sure that they don't get there. But even that, you don't always guarantee that they're not finding a way in to promote their agenda. Or like a religious sister who is very, very active in working with orphaned children, working with mothers, and I'm sitting right next to her executive, a beautiful lady that works very closely with her, and she's wearing a Population PSI T-shirt, Population Service International, bad group, and she's wearing a T-shirt. And we're sitting there talking with her, and I know the good that they're doing. I know they're not doing anything wrong, and so finally we got to talking about these groups, and I think Brian was the one that asked, "Well, sister, I know you must need financial resource in all this great difficulty. Who are some of the groups you're working?" And he really was just trying to kind of see, is sister maybe not aware? And she kind of paused and wasn't sure what Brian was speaking about directly. And I said, well, sister, let me give you an example. Do you know who PSI is? And I had the lady stand up, and I said, right here on her sleeve, among all these other beautiful religious symbols and everything else, Population Services International, one of the most dangerous groups working in population control. And sister kind of paused and says, wait a minute, they give us money to help us with, and a good thing. Mm-hmm. She says, but wait a minute, that means I'm getting them into these communities where the people would not let them go because they trust me. And her eyes really opened. And that's what we're talking about. That's an example where this is a big group, but that doesn't mean people in the rural communities know who they are, because they don't come in. I jokingly call them cobras, right? But and use them as an example in my way of approach. But they don't come in as a cobra. They come in as this beautiful thing, and they print themselves so beautifully and give you a wonderful language that they're going to help you with all these things. But the moment you bring them in, I've been told, and one more story, and I'll toss it back, is I was told in Africa, and right now I'll toss it to Brian a little bit. Let me see if both of our brains can pull what country we're in. But they were using distributors of fountain drinks, because these trucks get into the rural communities to distribute their goods, and they were using them to pass out contraception. So here's your Fanta, your root beer, or whatever it might be, and here's a box of condoms. I can't remember the country.
I don't remember either.
But we were in a country where the local priest was telling us how one of the distributors in the area gets in. Or we're in one of the parishes and this was in
The signs on the trees?
the signs
That was
on the trees.
Uganda.
That was in Uganda.
Uganda.
Local parish, the priest says, they put these signs up on the church grounds. I pull them off, and the next day they're back up again. Because what they do is they come in, and they, like Brian mentioned earlier about a subsidy or maybe a kind of an incentivizing, for every how many boxes of condoms you get 25 cents on the box. Or you keep putting these signs up, and I'll give you 10 cents a sign. So they just go out and just put signs everywhere. And the parish priest says, I pull them off. They put next morning, they're right back. He says, I just leave them up there now. Because he said, I just can't keep taking them off up and down.
Yeah, we've seen a couple of countries where, ever in Africa, when you stop at an intersection at a big city, people come and try to tell you things, sell you things, right? And in one of them, I believe it was Tanzania, and a couple of others, we saw MSI T-shirts on all of these people. If you give them a free T-shirt, they'll wear it. Doesn't matter what it says on it. These are poor people, and that means a lot to them. So all you see is all these people with the Stopes International all over them.
I said, Brian, remember the example, we were in Kenya, in Nairobi, and of course, like many parts of the world, stuck in traffic, and a guy right in the middle of the road wearing a white T-shirt with different propaganda on it, some of which was population control, and he's selling, steering wheel covers and, dangling goodies for your car and all your water, and we were stuck. And Brian is the one who did it. He says, you know what group that is that you have on your shirt? And of course the guy doesn't know who that is. It's a free T-shirt. And so, but it's a billboard. So again, when Congress people or legislators say, oh, we don't have big billboards. Yes, you do. They're walking right down your street every day wearing T-shirts. Don't tell me it's not here. Okay. That's an example, and then of course that young man doesn't know, but he might have been, given a box of those. He might have been giving that to all his friends who are selling those goods down the street, and they're all wearing the same T-shirt. It might even have a phone number on it. I don't remember if this one did, but the letters were very clear. And that's what Brian says. You know what that represents, what group that is? And so it really is like with Sister's friend or helper. When she heard it was PSI, she went and changed the shirt. She walked out and went get another shirt, because I wasn't trying to embarrass her, but just saying it's an example that we don't realize, how much this is tentacled to so many things. And to expose the underbelly is a real, it's an effort. And to that, before I give it back to you, I want to make a compliment to all of HLI's, pro-life leaders around the world, because these men and women every day are out there fighting that fight. And those that join them and those that we've had the privilege of educating, forming, still mentoring, still supporting, the network's growing. The team is getting bigger. What Father Marks began with was something small, and so that legacy now has grown, and that makes a huge difference. And they deserve, the recognition, because they're the ones out there with sweat, blood, and tears, fighting that good fight and sacrificing for these great goods. And I've watched people from just like we have here, where many of our fellow colleagues in the pro-life movement have been very successful, like 40 Days and Students for Life and many others out there, to see people come from the other side of the aisle, people who worked in Planned Parenthood and abortion facilities convert. And we see that in the field. We see it out there. So by being there, by being vocal, by being present, by doing what we're doing, it's bringing people into the light. And that is a win. Doctors, nurses, professionals, and I'll toss this back. I remember one final story, and it involves love stories. We can be here all day if you want to. So, and that is, this was back in Kenya. We were with Father Raphael Wanjohi, who worked with HLI for over 30 years, now a priest in his 80s, still living and not as active anymore. But he is the one that helped really create and found that great pro-life movement. But he was a seminary professor, he was a rector, he helped with the Catholic University. And I remember sitting down, brought by Father Wanjohi and Father Samuel Gatimu, who's now a student of his, now our director in Kenya. And we were met with some of the professionals, and they were lawyers. And I remember this one gentleman who was a former judge, country justice, Supreme Justice, and retired. And he says, Father Wanjohi, and he pointed to a young gentleman in the room, this gentleman. He says, that young man, He says he now presents cases before the court. I had the privilege of being there before I became emeritus. And he says, I knew that man was a student of Father Juan Johi. This is a formidable foe in this courtroom. He understands philosophy, understands the principles, and is articulate. And he says, that's what you need. So I say that because these are how you win, is by bringing those principles and teaching and forming and never giving up. So I want to just really thank, our leaders out there, and for those that are listening who are not familiar with who they are, come to our website. Be happy for you to learn who they are and to pray for them and to pray for their good.
One thing that's really struck me throughout this conversation is how similar what's going on in the rest of the world is to the United States and how different it is. So you have things like sex education, which we have here in the States. It's been one of the main propaganda tools for trying to spread this message of casual sex, contraception, and abortion to students. But then also how different. We don't have vaccines that they're saying are malaria vaccines that are actually Depopulation. We don't have things that they're saying are vitamins that are actually sterilizing women. What are some of the things that you've seen in the mission field that you think would be the most surprising for an American audience? Maybe Brian, you can take this one first.
Well, I kind of said it before, it's a complete disregard of the dignity of a human person. They really are treated like animals, like cattle. There's no informed consent in this area of sexual and reproductive health at all in many of these countries. They're just seen as objects to be aborted or sterilized. So I think that's what people find the most surprising, although you see that in the United States too. My wife, Kathy, every day has to deal with young ladies who have been abused by the medical system. And you see that people think that black women are not real smart. A lot of these doctors do, and so they give them a semi-permanent form of birth control, like the Norplant or the Depo-Provera injection. And these young ladies know nothing about what's happening to their body.
In Africa, you mean?
This is the United States.
Oh, really?
Right here in Front Royal.
Was banned here in I thought Norplant was banned in the United States.
Well, I mean perhaps the successors to Norplant. Okay. Yes, yeah, you're right. It was banned in the United States, although still used in several other countries. Mm-hmm. But this is the kind of mentality. It's not just a United States thing or an Africa thing. It's a worldwide thing. It's a culture of death way of thinking about things. And so that's the fundamental similarity you will see all around the world, whether it be Sweden, Canada, United States, whether it be Kenya, DR Congo, or any of these other places. The people who buy into this culture of death mentality don't have respect for people as creations of God.
Actually, before I hand this over to Father, I have one question to follow up on the Norplant. Is it true that there's birth control that's been banned in the U.S. because it's not safe? It's quote unquote not safe. They've done studies that it's causes all these bad side effects for women that then gets sent to places like Africa to give to women there.
Oh, it is. I've seen it myself. I went through Nigeria. You see medical clinics which have, they don't have any safe motherhood kits, no prenatal vitamins, anything like that, but pallets and pallets of birth control, most of which is expired. So they'll dump anything they can on the Africans.
Wow. Okay. So, Father, there's the question again to you. What have you seen that you think would be the most shocking to Americans?
Well, in our country, Brian just mentioned, the approach toward healthcare itself. We have our own issues here, and many abuses within our healthcare systems that we can enunciate very easily. But what's sad is you see the same mentality being approached or being brought into the mission world. So where the assumption is that we know better. So it's very paternalistic. We know best for you. We're going to tell you how you should raise your children. We're going to tell you, how many children. We're going to tell you, if you can have a child, how many you can have, and without ever really considering that as these are human beings. These are persons with inalienable, immutable dignity. They're not less than anyone here or greater than anyone here. We are equal in dignity. And so information that should be given to them to make ethical decisions are not given to them. Matter of fact, much of the information is pulled out of the packets of medication or the contraception, or is never even discussed. And so they're not even made aware that there are harms, there are possibilities of harms, there are long-term impacts to them. And so you see this and you hear their stories, and you realize what's made them so ill is because of multiple use of different types of drugs. And what really they do need, and Brian just mentioned, are these prenatal vitamins and real care to help them to have healthy pregnancies and to be healthy mothers and to provide the means for their families, are not given to them. And it really is shocking. I think, like here in the States, when people are exposed to this and they hear of these events, people get very angry, very passionate. Especially in our own country where autonomy is so worshipped. And it's almost as an absolute. And all of a sudden, but for some reason, people become deaf, to how we treat the developing world and how we look at people in their plight or their difficulties, and we think, well, we know better for them. But then when you show them the consequences, people just they get angry. When I travel around the United States, to visit, for various programs or to visit our own donors, and I share stories, and of course they already are in the cause because they're already passionate, but you tell them and they get angry, they get very upset. How is that possible? Why doesn't their government? And what Brian and I both have noticed is because of corrupt governments, because of corrupt systems, and these are the people, their own people are being exploited, and they're allowing them to be exploited for their own ill-gotten gain. And I would say that is really angering. And I think Americans get upset here when they see it. All the more they would be upset to see it around the world. And if I may, I'm going to leave the country nameless, but I will tell you I sat down with a government official, and we talked about the corruption. And Brian had done a little research, and the regional director had given me some research, and on how much money was being lost yearly to corruption. And of course, there was no absolute figure, but it was close enough. And I sat down over a cup of tea, and I brought up to this minister of government, and I said, well, tell me, I understand, you can correct me if my numbers are really, really off, but I understand. And at the time, whatever that number was, I said what it was, and they kind of perked up. And I said, so I must be close just based on your expression. What could be done with that money that's been lost to corruption for the good of the people of this country? And for that brief moment, the person answered without thinking. Now, there was no cameras, there's no microphone, no one, I was just me sitting down with the person. Clean water, proper health care. And I said, what do you mean by proper? They said, none of the things that we've been talking about. Real care. And started going. Then all of a sudden, they realized what they were saying and then quieted down, because I think they were afraid if other people might hear what they just said. They know, just like we know, it doesn't have to be this way. Corruption doesn't have to be, and so I really believe that, we that's why the three of us in this room as our audience, we are impassioned. We are very serious about this, and we do take it personally, because these are our brothers and sisters, and whatever happens to them happens to us, and we believe that and hold that dear. And I would want our people in this country, our brothers and sisters, our fellow citizens, to take greater interest in what our government does, and that we could be an instrument of great good. And we do. We have a lot of good that we do around the world, and that needs to continue. We are a very generous country, but we also do great harm. And sadly, because of an ideology and because of a mentality and a framework that harms people and doesn't promote great good, it's time for us to wake up. And I'm so grateful to Brian for doing that with you last week on one document. And it would be great for us to continue to talk about how other documents and other policies are affecting the world.
Definitely. It seems like that podcast has been very well received. So hopefully keep talking about this conversation, talking about what's going on, and then talking about how we can help, what we can do to heal the problems that have been created. Brian, do you have any last thoughts before we wrap up for today on anything you'd like to tell our audience?
Now, just one thing, we can't do it without you. And by that, I mean pray for us, donate if you can, and most important of all, get out there and do something against the culture of death. It'll do you good, it'll do the country good, it'll do the faith good.
Yeah, for sure. Father, do you have any last thoughts today?
Ditto. I think it's exactly, I mean, it's the idea that we need people to be invested, and whatever that level of investment is, but to be invested. I mean, John Paul, Pope Francis, Pope Benedict, I mean, have made it clear over the last, 50 years, that we really need to be involved, and we need to not be sitting down just waiting for things to happen. We have to take interest. So, and the reason why I mentioned 50 years, because even Paul VI, John the 23rd, we have been talking about these issues for now decades. And the realization is, and the church has been warning us, guiding us, trying to help us. We need to heed the message of the church and realize that our shepherds, especially our pontiffs, with the bishops around the world, have been very vocal, which means all of us need to get involved. So that's why I say ditto, because it is so important for people to be aware, and awareness should bring us to activism. And that activism should just inspire us to inspire other people to want to be involved, to understand, so that, again, great good can be accomplished. That's what this is about, is promoting the great good and helping people, to know that good and to want that good. And so sadly, and I say this with all the charity of my heart, we have too many of our fellow Catholics, our fellow Christians, the Jewish brothers and sisters who share our principles, on many and on these issues, and that are just sitting on the sidelines, letting a few do what all of us should be doing. And I say that with all the charity of my heart, but also the invitation is rise, let's get up. And part of that is challenge our legislators, challenge our local political leaders. Don't accept the agenda. Fight against those agendas. Become more aware of what those agendas are. What's happening in your local school boards? What's happening in your local community? What's happening in your own state? How do state policies affect our federal policies eventually? What our federal policies are. How are our taxes being used? What's happening? Be aware and then do something about it. Positively do something about it.
I don't think I could say anything better than what both of you said. To our audience members, I will put a link in the description to donate. We're going into our year-end campaign right now to try to start our mission at the UN, and so I will put a link to that homepage in the description, so you can go donate there. And also, yeah, get involved. Follow the podcast. Follow us on social media so that we keep trying to update you on all of those platforms of what's going on and inform you more about the global fight for life and family. Father and Brian, thank you for coming on the podcast today. This has been such a great conversation, really informative. I love hearing the very tangible stories that really illustrate what it's like in those other countries, because sometimes it's easy to hear all these theoretical things and then hearing the more personal side stories, just like the man on the side of the road who was wearing the t-shirt for these population control groups. Just hearing what this looks like in the everyday has been really helpful. So thank you.
Thank you, Colleen.
Thank you.
And to all of our listeners, please subscribe, give us a 5-star review, and drop any questions you have in the comments. Hopefully we can answer them for you in future episodes. And keep on living the culture of life. God bless.